Absolutely. The chair recognizes Jared.
Thank you, Mary Alice. So one question I had was about, we've heard a bit about a notary requirement for complaints. Mikhail, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? My understanding is that that requirement, I haven't seen it in the ordinance. Do you know when that came about or why that requirement exists?
Can I add something right here?
Oh, go ahead, Vasilia. Sure.
Okay. The notary is a requirement for the police complaint itself, and the police complaint that requirement existed prior to the CPRB being established, and as a result, as the ordinance was being drafted, the police procedure was just basically put into the ordinance itself.
Okay, so that requirement is not in our ordinance. It's a police policy.
No. Well, it was a part of police policy prior to the CPRB being created.
Sure. No, I understand that. And so it was, is it in the ordinance? Or it's just something?
I believe the language is in the ordinance that the complaint has to be notarized.
Actually, okay. Can I speak to that?
Go ahead, Diane.
Yes, go ahead, Diane.
I had an hour-long conversation with Scott Dossett this afternoon, which was great because he's the historian for the CPRB, but we talked about this requirement, and it apparently the notary requirement is actually on the form, the complaint form. But I believe he indicated it wasn't written into the ordinance itself, but it's always been part of the complaint form. And as Vasilia indicated, that was incorporated into the process.
Okay.
And that's to confirm identity. You know, that was part of the process to confirm identity.
I saw Scott raised his hand briefly, but he put it back down. So I'm assuming he was going to confirm what you just saying.
So Jared, do you want me to still keep the chair or would you like it back?
No, I'm going to continue with just another question or comment, but
Scott has raised his hand.
Scott did raise his hand. I just noticed it. If you wanted to recognize him.
Okay, I will unmute you, Scott, and recognize you.
Hi, it's Mary Alice and everyone for all your time. Yeah, the story kind of unfolds after a big debate. It was vigorous within the CPRB as we were coming up with our policies and procedures and, you know, kind of laying this all out. I think Todd Rent really envisioned a system that was driven very much from the HRO and not the police department, that might give people more legal standing based on them having had a form that was notarized. And I can't critique Todd for that, but that's the way the conversation developed about that particular item. Other than that, I think it's pretty evident that there's this dynamic tension that we have between those two offices, one of which has been unmanned for a while. So I won't get started on that. I'll just leave. Thank you so much.
Jared?
Thanks for adding that, Scott. Thank you, Mary Alice. Okay, well, that's good to know that some history on that and why it's on the form, even though it's not in the ordinance. And obviously there's a little bit of, I think, what are we following, the form or the ordinance here? I didn't have a lot of specifics on the CPRB as it exists today. Just as a comment to council is, you know, with it being almost entirely unfunctional since its creation and not giving its reports, not doing its due diligence and what it was prescribed to do by ordinance. You know, even though we're going to try and resurrect this, and it may be a tool in our toolbox about how we look at what we're going to do with our police department moving forward, coming from the calls of the public. I would strongly encourage members to look beyond members of the council, talking to you guys, look beyond simply what is possible through the CPRB as the ordinance is written today, and remind folks that, you know, if we really take into consideration what the calls are from the public and what the best and brightest folks who are looking at what people really need to do to have transformative change in police departments, that it extends beyond even our ordinance of the CPRB, that I would encourage everyone to think that we need to think beyond, you know, well, what can the CPRB do better? Because even if we are able to get it functional again and bringing reports to us, it's not going to get at some of the roots of these larger issues that we're facing with police departments across the country: lack of accountability, lack of oversight, and especially civilian oversight over police departments. So just a comment to folks, you know, and this is one of the reasons why, you know, at the last meeting, and I'll, you know, continue to say that we need to have a special meeting to discuss, you know, this issue in depth, because it, you know, CPRB is just one portion of this equation, and it goes way beyond the issues that are here. And I think, but council members obviously did a great job in addressing some of the issues, and it is one part of the piece, but I think the picture is a lot bigger, and we need to not lose sight of the bigger things that are going on here that extend beyond the CPRB. And that's it for my comments, Mary Alice. If you want to,
Would you like the chair back?
Sure, and I'll recognize folks to respond.
Can I interject, if I may?
Go ahead, Carol.
Thanks. I was trying to raise my hand, and for some reason I don't have that option on my screen. But you know, the subject of the notary is something that Jim Simon and I have been discussing recently, because we have gotten some appeals of that issue on CPRB or the police complaint forms. So I think that Jim could add some more a greater understanding for folks about the nexus between what the ordinance says in terms of the need for a sworn statement and the use of the notary, the notarization.
Okay.
Thanks.
Jim, did you want to comment?
Yes, I can comment. Carol is right. We have been discussing this. The ordinance, as reflected in the form, does require a verification of the complaint, essentially that the person filing the complaint essentially attests that he or she has knowledge of the facts that they're alleging, and personal knowledge of the facts, and that they believe them to be true and correct to the best of their ability. It is, the notary is not the attestation. The notary is simply that the person, the notary, signs his or her notary public area on the form, attesting to the fact that the person who is executing the form is in fact the person, i.e. somebody's not signing somebody else's name. Not too long ago, the Notary Act was amended to in fact require notaries to check identifications to make sure that the person who represents him or herself to be the person signing the form is in fact that person. It is customary that verifications, and it's used all the time in court, verifications include a notary. A typical court verification reads something like this: under penalties as provided in law pursuant to section 1-109 of the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure, the undersigned certifies that the factual statements set forth in our case, the complaint, to which this verification is appended are true and correct, except as to matters therein stated to be on information and belief. And as such matters, the undersigned certifies as aforesaid, that he verily believes the same to be true. Then the individual signs that verification, and the notary places his or her signature, the date when the notarization occurs, and either a seal or a stamp. And it is the notary's obligation to assure that the person signing the form is in fact that person. And that's probably ultimately how whoever drafted the original form, going however far back, my suspicion is it might have been somebody in legal before Kurt, Michelle, or I appeared on the scene, who included a notary on the verification part of the form. So it is customary in court proceedings. You know, a lot of judges require it, if not by statute.
Thanks for the background. Bill Colbrick, I had seen your hand before. Bill Brown, I'll call on you right after him.
Yeah, thanks for recognizing me. I'm going to also read from the law, and the other council members may not be aware, but there is a law that is titled, Illinois law, Uniform Peace Officers Disciplinary Act. So I believe the history of this was based in just a series of complaints nationwide and in the state. And basically, the law was created in order to give police officers some basic fundamental rights in the investigation and disciplinary process. Understanding that police officers are citizens, they have rights. Police officers are employees, they have employment rights. And there's to the point of the notary, there's a section in the law that basically says the officer, before administrative proceedings are instituted, the officer shall be, and I'm quoting now, the officer shall be informed beforehand of the names of all complainants. So that speaks to Mr. Simon's comment that it's used to affirm the person's identity, because obviously if a police officer is going to be disciplined, if he's going to have consequences to his career, possibly lose pay, possibly lose his job, it is his or her right to have a fair process. And part of that fair process is to know who is complaining against him. So I just want everybody to be aware that law, once again, it's titled the Uniform Peace Officers Disciplinary Act. And people like me have to abide by that whenever there is complaints and an investigation that is launched against a sworn police officer. And I haven't had the opportunity to in-depth review the police officers' collective bargaining agreement, but I just want to make note that there's a lot of collective bargaining agreements for police officers in the state of Illinois that also includes some sort of language that guides how a complaint process is done, how investigations are done, and how disciplines are done as well. So between those two bodies, those two documents, I think that we need to be cognizant of those. And I think the public needs to understand that the public just can't say, hey, we want this and let's impose this. The council, we can't just have these wishes and wants either. We're actually guided by the constraints and the guidance of the law and other documents like collective bargaining agreements. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Bill Brown.
Yeah, and thanks, Bill, for that. I've had that in my mind, and I know a lot of people weren't aware of that, but that amount of detail was really helpful. But I had one other request for the report. When you bring the report back, in the ordinance, it mentions the Human Relations Office shall develop written standards for orientation and continuing education for all CPRB members, and it's subject to the approval of the mayor and council. And I don't remember seeing those. It would have been before I was on the council, but if those exist and you could provide those, that would be good. They should probably, and it may be something too that you need to rework because you'll have a new member coming up. So whatever you decide, or whatever the CPRB in conjunction with other people decide, I'd like to see that brought too. Thanks.
Thanks, Brown. Dennis, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Considering the forms, we're talking a little bit about the forms. I'd just like to input in. I've heard from, I guess, the public in general that they would like to see it easier to be filing forms, or make the process of filing a form for complaint easier to understand. And so when we have a form and we're using oaths, and we're using that words like "I verily attest" to the facts that I'm stating are true, I would wonder, isn't it possible to phrase the form in a more normal civil language, or do we have to use the approved lingo of the jurisprudence system just for our own CPRB activities? I think it sets up a barrier for people who feel like they don't know what they're signing exactly, and what the implications are in the long term for them. I think they should be taken as seriously. But I think that speaking in plain language for the CPRB format is going to be an assistance to the public in general.
Thanks, Dennis. Eric, I see your hand. Go ahead.
There's still a point of fact that I'm not sure I understand. I understand the rationale for notarizing the signature on the original complaint. I mean, the other aspect of that hasn't been mentioned is I would hate to have somebody else file a complaint and sign my name to it and not have the identity verified. But that being said, I still don't know whether the appeal must be notarized. Far less reason for requiring a notary on the appeal, because we absolutely know where the complaint began.
Thanks, Eric. Mikhail, Elizabeth, or Jim, do you guys want to comment on notarization of appeals? Go ahead, Mikhail.
I actually don't know. Maybe Scott does. I was going to ask so one of the communications that I received in the last few minutes is that Champaign does not require a notary for a complaint. And so I'm wondering if any that were just described to us.
Jim, do you have any insight into that, or Elizabeth?
I have no insight as to how Champaign operates with their CPRB. I will tell you, I've not had that much exposure to our CPRB, but getting back to Dennis's comment about prudence in terms of forms, when we file appeals in the Seventh Circuit and in our case down here, the Fourth Circuit State Court, and in the United States Supreme Court and the Illinois Supreme Court, those briefs and statements, there's some attestation. It's more in terms of form rather than substance, because obviously it's mostly argument. So at least there's some kind of, history to it. But as Dennis indicated, that's up to you all. It's a policy decision whether to follow that, and it would be a CPRB decision in terms of language. Going back to Dennis's question, I would see no problem in using more of a layman's language for the verification rather than a more legalese at all. Okay. Again, it has to be worded still carefully to make sure it does what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Scott, you might have a comment on that. I see your hand raised. I'll go ahead and recognize you.
Yeah, thank you. The ordinance does not have any kind of detail whatsoever in terms of how the appeal process is actually elicited or managed. At this point in time, we've had the original complaint, which should be housed in HRO. The police department has done an internal investigation. The chief writes a nice letter. the complainant gets back and says, I'm not happy. I don't know that we have ever used a separate form of any sort to elicit that appeal. It's kind of common knowledge. The complainant gets back to the chief, and I don't really know. The best person to answer that would probably be, well, chiefs who's gone through an appeal. And so Chief Serafin would have done one, just a couple of weeks ago, or months ago. So that's just a little input.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
Jared,
Cecilia, go ahead.
I just want to give a little history here. The notary issue didn't become an issue until COVID, because the folks would bring their complaint in and the police staff would notarize the form for them. So this whole issue of notarizing and it came up as a result of the building being closed to the public.
Okay. That's interesting to know. Further council comments? I'm not seeing anybody's hand raised. I am curious with it seemed, this is obviously something that's going to need a lot of work still. And again, outside of the work specifically on the CPRB, which is important, I want folks to remember not to lose sight of the bigger picture in this. I think we're going to need probably another chance to talk about this in this format because we've raised some issues here, and I've gotten some information that's, we just need to make these things accessible. I think the consensus is there to do so, and in the process of tackling that, I think we'll get there. If there are not any further comments or questions for staff, we'll go ahead and move on to the next item. Okay, I'm not seeing, did I hear somebody? I didn't, I'm trying to watch everybody's video. Okay, all right. Well, we're gonna move on.